Welcome to the 200th episode of The Beau Show. Recently, my colleague at the Epoch Times, Phillipp, released a new documentary about January 6th. It's a fascinating exploration and explanation of how events unfolded that day, since mainstream media has portrayed it from one angle, without gathering all the facts. The January 6th Commission, which still holds hearings to this day, has called it an attack on the American system, likening it to Pearl Harbor or 9/11. So the fundamental question this documentary asks is this narrative really the case? Phillipp relies on one of the Epoch Times lead investigative reporters, Joe Hanneman, who reviews all of the footage they gathered on January 6th, since being comprehensive and even exhaustive is necessary to get the story right, free from bias. Hanneman talks about the DC and Capitol Police presence firing munitions such as tear gas and pellets deep into the crowd for an hour, when they had said that they wouldn't do that. The documentary also focuses on Victoria White, who was beaten 40 times in the head with a baton after getting trapped in the side of a Capitol tunnel. As a mother of 4 mixed-race kids, she does not accept the label of being called a racist for being in DC and at the Capitol that day. Again, the narrative is that she fought police rather than the other way around. So her message is, if they can lie about her, they can lie about anyone. The documentary also heavily relies on the expertise of Stan Kefart, an expert on police force and crowd control. Kefart analyzes every moment of footage to determine whom the aggressors were and whether police acted in a way that follows their protocols but also is within the bounds of the law. At first glance, Kefart says that the police are supposed to put up a wall of defense between the Capitol and the protesters. Kefart describes the police strategy that day as not a wall of defense, but a firing line, in which the police are mounted high up, creating a downward shooting line with munitions. Video shows a motorcycle officer pushing one of the protesters off the scaffolding rather than apprehending him. Body cam footage shows another officer manically lobbing not just his munitions, but those of other officers into the crowd, placing everyone at great risk. Some of these munitions include burning grenades and dispersion grenades. If the burning grenades hit a person rather than the ground, it can cause severe bodily harm. Tactics that include pushing downward, which caused the crowd to fall backwards, and chasing people with drop kick methods were elements that Kefart believes created both a lack of safety and a further hostility. All along, of course, the narrative has been treason and insurrection. That's the key word you hear, an attack on democracy. 865 people have been charged, and some still sit behind bars without a trial. Many of those charges could be merely misdemeanor trespassing. The FBI and the DOJ used their full force to find out who was at the Capitol that day. And just a mere person's presence alone began a pattern of shunning and even career peril as many began losing their jobs. The guilt by association proved perilous for many. Another of the documentary's interview subjects was Julie Kelly, senior writer for American Greatness. With no punches pulled, it is Kelly's view that all of this was by design. She believes that in order to bury criticism of the 2020 election and even the Russia collusion hoax, they needed to criminalize political dissent in an effort to kill off the MAGA movement once and for all. She believes that because Congress rejected extra security that day, that it was left intentionally unsecure, and thus in many ways was an inside job. The documentary then profiles the case of Matthew Perna, who was at the Capitol on January 6th, as told through the eyes of his Aunt Jerry. Perna pled guilty to felony obstruction charges and faced 20 years in prison. Whenever his hearing would come up, it would be punted down the road again, with the explanation that they were waiting for more discovery documents. This cycle of mentally preparing and then delay after delay was mentally exhausting for Perna. And after a battle with this, he resorted to suicide. His aunt talks of Matthew's generosity and kindness, speaking to strangers and comforting the elderly, and reading a book every single day. The arduous process of facing these charges and getting delay after delay seems to be a common one in the aftermath of January 6th. Meanwhile, looters throughout the riots of 2020 were not arrested or prosecuted, and many of those who were had charges dropped. Looters could steal up to $900 worth of merchandise free of prosecution. Even executives for prevention loss at CVS seemed to downplay their losses from these types of theft. Many of the J6 defendants still await trial, some in solitary confinement, deemed by the ACLU as a human rights violation. One such person is Jake Lang, who is being held in the D.C. Alexandria area, whom they tried to force into a decade-long plea deal. Because investigative journalism must be both fair and accurate, Hanneman describes some of the instigation by protesters that day, including those who hurled things at police, and even somehow got a 16-foot aluminum ladder there to act as a battering ram. Some had mops, brooms, the tops of trash cans, and a stereo speaker. A man from Alabama brought Molotov cocktails, but was arrested before he could actually use them. One man bull rushed an officer from behind with his full force. So there was evidence of some true violence by protesters that day, and that cannot be overlooked or dismissed. 4 people died on January 6th, and they were all Trump supporters: Ashley Babbitt, Roseanne Boyland, and 2 others who succumbed to heart attack and stroke. Police officer Sicknick died shortly thereafter from natural causes, a stroke, but the narrative had been that he was struck with a fire extinguisher. 4 officers committed suicide in the aftermath of January 6th. The documentary then zeroes in on the death of Ashley Babbitt. We know that she climbed into a window at the Capitol, where an officer shot her, and she died as a result of that wound. This is where Kefart becomes a meticulous analyst. He says that in order to discharge his weapon, an officer must show he's in immediate danger. And in the video, you can see him with his weapon drawn, as well as another officer with his weapon drawn a mere few feet away. Lieutenant Byrd shot Babbitt, and the protocol would then be to cuff Babbitt, administer first aid, close the scene off as a crime scene, have a CSI unit dispatched, and then of course write a discharge of firearms report. None of this seems to have happened. Kefart describes the Graham versus Connor litmus test of objective reasonableness. Strangely, even the DOJ used this language in its report of Lieutenant Byrd's actions in this incident. Kefart sees no objective reasonableness that would cause him to shoot Babbitt and believes this to be murder. Now, I couldn't help but think of the recent trial of Officer Derek Chauvin, who was ruled to have killed George Floyd. That was called murder, and this was a major catalyst in the BLM movement, that officers were using excessive force. And Chauvin did it in a very public way with his knee. He's been found guilty and has been sentenced to 21 years in prison. So it is interesting that as we consider police brutality, usually through the lens of race, that this same shooting of Ashley Babbitt by Lieutenant Byrd is not seen in the same vein. The races of the 2 parties are even reversed. Lieutenant Byrd's name was withheld from the public for months, and he provided no statement to investigators at the time. In video footage, you can see Babbitt try to stop Zachary Alam from bashing the window to the speaker's lobby. There is footage of her striking Alam in the face and asking police why they weren't doing anything to stop it. It's clear that she was apprehensive and upset at what Alam was doing. Her climbing through the window could even be said to have been an escape route from the suffocating crowd. The documentary also profiles Roseanne Boyland, who was in the Capitol tunnel. DC police released a gas that sucked oxygen out of the tunnel, which was a confined space, and then pushed the crowd back, and people tumbled out of it. Boyland passed out. They begged police to do something to help, but it doesn't seem police did anything. In fact, a female DC officer, as you can see, uses a cane or a stick to hit Boyland 3 times while she is down on the ground. The protocol is to not only not strike a downed person, but to administer first aid after. But she didn't. A guy even holds a crutch up to protect her as she's down. There was no immediate attempt to offer her first aid as she is dying, and they dragged her by the feet, like an animal, through the tunnel. The medical examiner ruled it a drug overdose of the ADHD medicine Adderall, but the family's own examiner came to a different conclusion. If someone was inhaling gas in a confined space, passes out, and is trampled and hit with a cane, an Adderall overdose seems a bit tough to believe. The man in the video who held a crutch over Roseanne Boyland to protect her was Luke Coffey. Coffey describes his immense faith in God and losing his wife in a car accident, so he considered it providential that he could protect a woman who was downed. In the aftermath of that day, a detective assured Coffey that he was not a suspect, and for 2 weeks things seemed okay. But then he received another call that said that further video had made things look much worse for him. Coffey has been offered plea deals to accept felony assault with a deadly weapon, which is that crutch that he held up that day. An unusual factor in the aftermath of January 6th is that there were about 80 to 100 suspicious actors on site that day that have not been identified, listed, or charged. Some people have been listed on the FBI's most wanted list, but a majority have not. Many were at the Capitol well before Trump's speech was even over, but have no identity. Some were seen smashing windows at the Capitol and pulling glass out of windows, but then retreated once they were being filmed. And some of those people were concealed by facial bandanas. Then there is the suspicious case of Ray Epps. On January 5th, Epps is on video saying that tomorrow they need to go into the Capitol. Now, some have been arrested for urging this very thing, but Epps was never arrested or charged. How is it that such plain evidence can be seen, but yet Epps gets no attention?